unexpected words. You delivered them all so quickly and disappeared in the background. Another circumstance, one more for a hopeless romance. Miss my last opportunity. Redeem this broken will. Appeal to the lost and lonely. No one is sorrier than me. Morning hours till morning, still thinking over. My head is tossing and turning.
Hi, in this screencast I'm going to kind of demonstrate a fairly quick way of creating a kind of sunset or silhouette scene, and I'm also going to demonstrate how to use, or one way of using the clone tool to kind of randomize a background. So let's get started. First thing I'll do is hit Control-Shift-D to bring up the document properties and just turn off the border. Next thing I'll do is create my overall image, and like in the intro, I like to do a kind of vertical rectangle shape, but you can do whatever you like. So what I'll do is I'll create something that's maybe 600 wide by 900 high, something like this. So that's going to be the our image. Next, I will duplicate this. Actually, I'll make one of these black. Bring up the fill and stroke dialog box, and I will make one fully opaque and black. Okay, and I'll just hit Control-D, create a duplicate of it. You can see here, and I will make that one a different color. Let's say any kind of blue we want for now. It doesn't really matter. So we'll bring up the alignment dialog, Control-Shift-A, just get those back in line, and probably I will well, we'll leave the blue one on top for now. Okay, next thing I'm going to do is create my kind of landscape here, and this is completely random. I use the freehand tool and just create some kind of landscape that suits your fancy. Make sure it ends on the same point you started with. It'll be a closed shape. You hit F1 to select that shape you just created, and you can go in at this point and look at it. If it looks a little too smooth, which it usually does, you can do something, quick thing here to roughen it up. What I tend to do is you can double click it and see how many nodes there are. There's a fair amount of nodes, but it's still kind of rounded. So one quick way of kind of getting maybe that a little more jaggedy looking, so to speak, is to select the shape, choose Effects, Modify Path, and Add Nodes, and then play with this value. Probably I'll leave it at maybe a 10. Hit Apply. Now you won't see any difference right now, but when I double click now you see there's a heck of a lot more nodes along here. Okay. Hit F1 again to make sure it's selected, and again go to the Effects menu, Modify Path, and Jitter Nodes. And again, you can play with these values a little bit. Let's say if we want these to be jittered up by maybe 3 pixels. We'll hit Apply, and if you take a closer look at this now, we've got kind of a jagged, more randomized looking surface. So we'll leave that for now. Now I want to make this, just want this intersected part, so I'll click my shape and I will hold Shift and select the blue rectangle, and I will choose Path Intersection, and it takes the part of the paths that are both intersect each other. So there's our landscape. Now obviously we don't want this blue, we probably want this black, but for now we'll leave it blue and we'll focus our work on this background. This part's fairly simple. What I do is I want to create probably a 4-color gradient on this rectangle to kind of imitate a sunset. So let's get started. Let's see. We'll make sure that whole rectangle is selected. We'll bring up the fill and stroke dialog box and make sure the stroke is off. We'll select linear gradient, and once that gradient is up there, we'll click edit to bring up the gradient editor. And now I'm going to want 4 stops. The first thing I tend to do is always, if I want all the stops to be fully opaque, I'll make sure I go to the other stop that's now transparent. I'll make that fully opaque, and I'm going to, I've got 2 stops now. I'm going to add another stop, so now I've got 3, and another stop, so now I've got 4 stops. Okay. We'll say we'll leave the first one black. We want the second one to be some kind of blue, sky blue, and this is where you have to kind of play with the values to get what you like. Let's say it's something like this, maybe a little less saturation. So we want to go from from black to blue, probably to orange. This is the one I always find tricky. Orange, I seem to have to always go up in saturation, or else it ends up looking too brown. We can back it off a little bit. And then finally the last stop will be red. And we'll leave that kind of a fairly saturated but a darker red. Something like this. Okay, so that may not be perfect. You can always adjust it. For now we'll leave it. Close the gradient editor. We can actually move the fill and stroke dialog box off. And now what I want to do is obviously turn this gradient 90 degrees. So what I will do is double click it, and it brings up these handles for editing the gradient. I'll take one end, drag it up to the top, and it will snap usually to the top. Take the other end, and now I'm going to hold the control key, so that it rotates in increments. I can make sure that it's vertical. I don't want to have something that's out of kilter, unless of course you're going for that effect. I'll hold control and I'll drag this down. You can see behind the landscape. Now this is where we can kind of play with these. I think it's in Inkscape 0.46 that they introduced these handles into the gradient editor tool. So now I can just grab these handles and adjust them up and down to kind of get the effect I want. And I'm probably going to want maybe bring the red up, a little more red in that. Still not exactly how I want, but we'll do for this purpose. Again, if you're grabbing the end ones, make sure you hold the control key. Okay, and this will look a little bit different when we change this foreground. This one here, we'll change that back now to full black. Okay, so I kind of get you can see how I get my kind of silhouette of a landscape. And you can put anything you want on this landscape. Now, the hard part being you've got to have a silhouette kind of to put on there. You can try, I've done things like traced over log homes and things like that, and into vector form, and then I've put them on the landscape where I need them. So one thing I did was I took a picture of my daughter that I had from a recent vacation, and let's see if we go import. I've already traced it, converted it into a vector. You can see it way down here, and it's just a vector of her that I took walking. I traced over a photo of her walking on the beach with this pail. It's a very rough trace, but she's going to be fairly small in this image, so it's not really critical. The detail is not absolutely critical. But then I go in and just by eye adjust how I want her to look. How big I want her to be, and make sure she gets placed somewhere kind of realistic. I don't know, maybe somewhere like this, just walking over the crest of that hill. So that's your basic, silhouette scene. Like I say, you can do a lot more creative things than that. The other part of this tutorial is really focused on, I wanted to try and get kind of realistic looking starry background. So I thought, well, I could plunk in stars wherever I wanted and try to make it work that way. And by all means, go ahead. You could do that perfectly well. And then I thought, well, I know very little about the clone tool, so I thought maybe, you know what, I'll try it out, see if I can come to grips with it by actually trying something that I want to get accomplished. So what I'll do is, first of all, create some object that will represent one of the stars. And right now you can't see that because it's black. We'll make it white. And you can see it's just a circle. That's all I've done. Now I will create a star shape. And the way I did this is just setting, using the star tool, set 5 corners. You can set whatever you want. And then you can play with these numbers up here. There's also handles here you can play with. Obviously you can do kind of neat things sometimes if you play with these tools. They seem fairly simple, but you can get some neat designs out of them. So for now, I'm going to create something like this, and I'll put this kind of over top, just roughly. And what I'll do is I will highlight both of them and choose Path Union, and that just makes the whole thing, one object. Okay, for my purpose. So next, I want to. Now, how do I randomize this? Well, using the clone tool, what I can do is, first of all, I'll make this a little bit smaller, and I want to create an array of stars here. First of all, so what I'll do is select that star, then choose Edit, Clone, Create Tiled Clones. Okay, and for these purposes, I'll hit this reset button, so it should change all these settings back to their defaults. Okay, so this is which, if you've never used the Tile Clones dialog box, you should be starting at the same point I am here. So first of all, I will go to, and it looks pretty daunting, there's all these tabs, but if you play around with them, you can kind of figure out fairly quickly what they do. So first of all, remember, you have to have the object that you're going to clone. You have to have that highlighted. Down at the bottom, you'll see you can either specify the number of rows and columns you want. So for instance, if I wanted 5 rows and 10 columns, I could specify that and then hit Create, and it will create 5 rows and 10 columns. I don't want that. I'll hit the Remove button. You can also hit Control-Z to undo. I want to do it by width and height, and what that will do is, for the width and height I specify, it will fill up as much as it can with those objects. So let's say we know my object was, I believe, 600 by 900. So I probably want, let's see, just as a test, probably want to fill up this kind of area. So if I create a rectangle there, I can see the width is 560 and 176. So let's delete that. Again, hit F1 for the selection tool. We'll highlight that, and maybe we'll go width 500, and let's say 200. And we'll hit. You're going to do a bunch of tests here. You can see that in the intro. I did a whole whack of tests in that sped up intro, just to try and create the effect I wanted. And that's the idea here. So I can't stand the fact this dialog box is so huge. Let me see if I can get things a little clearer. Maybe that's better. So we got 500 by 200. Hit Create. That's the area it's going to fill up, and that's pretty good. That's kind of, if I back out, that's kind of what I want. Okay. So again, remove, and now we can start playing with the settings. So under Shift, what I want to do is X. When they say Shift X, that means how much are we going to shift over to the right per row, per column, and then they give you this randomized value. So if you leave these as 0, it just goes immediately beside the next one, as you just saw. Okay? And if I change this percentage, this is a percentage of the object's width. So if that object right now, what it's selected, it's showing me the width is about 24 here. Up in this box you can see that. I might want to shift over, say, I don't know, 100%. Or sorry, not in this column. My mistake. You want it to shift per column. This is where it gets a bit confusing. People make mistakes early on. They can't figure out what it's supposed to do. You want it per column to shift over 100%. Okay? We'll hit create, and you can see now that all of these are shifted over the full width plus another space of that full width of star. Okay? That's probably still too close together for what I want, so I'll hit remove. I don't know, we'll hit 200 maybe, and in the Y direction, probably per row, I want it to shift maybe 200 as well. Okay, let's see what I get from that. So that's something a little wider spaced. Okay, and you can see that because we're using the width and height, it never exceeds that rectangle that we decided upon at the beginning. Okay, so that's fine. Now, still obviously doesn't look very natural, so what we'll do is then remove this, your settings will remain, and move on to, or actually at this point we'll hit randomize. I think we'll change these randomized values, and I had good luck with going something fairly high. We can play around with these again. Let's try 200% and 200% randomization, and I will hit create. You can see I get a fairly wide array. It almost looks like a constellation. Probably want, we'll hit remove, and maybe let's try something higher. Okay, it's some kind of randomization. It's still not ideal. We might want to back off these values to 100 again and see what happens. So that's something there. It's, you know, it's fairly good. Maybe not perfect, but for now, maybe we'll leave that. We'll hit remove. We'll leave those settings in. What scale does is it actually will scale the object per row and per column a certain percentage. Okay, and I believe they go up to 100%. Nope, they go higher than that. So for now, let's see, if we just randomize this, leave it at 0 and randomize 50 and 50, let's see what happens now. So you see what happens is you get stars that are bigger, smaller, all different sizes, okay? And remember, because we're randomizing, when we hit remove and create, we get a different pattern each time. Okay? So you might like that because, you know, the scale tab, because you can get bigger stars, smaller stars, or brighter ones, whatever you want to call them. So let's leave that in. Maybe 50% is fine. Rotation, what that will do is actually, if you hit a randomized value on the rotation, it'll actually rotate the stars randomly each time. So let's say that at 50. Remove what we have, hit create. And now you can see the stars are no longer all oriented the same, they're rotated. Okay? That's getting a little better. Now, blur and opacity. I didn't have that much great luck with the blur. I just didn't find that it added anything to it. I'll show you in a second. I am going to blur these, but I'm just going to blur the original, and that will blur all of the clones automatically. Okay, I'm not putting the blur on right now, simply because I have a 5-year-old computer, and every time I do this remove and create, I'm going to have to wait a few extra seconds for all those blurs to regenerate. So I've decided I'll just leave the blur out until the last step, and we can just blur the original, and all the subsequent clones will get blurred. Okay, so blur we'll leave alone at 0. Fade out. Okay, I don't want to decrease the opacity of the stars by, well, actually I do by row. I want them to fade out as we go down from the top of the sky towards the blue. We want these stars to fade out. So let's just play around with the values again. Let's go 25%, per row of fade out. We'll hit remove, create, and now you see the stars are brightest at the top and they generally fade out towards the bottom. Okay, we can probably remove that, maybe even go 30, create, get something that I like there. Okay, and okay, so we've got the blur and opacity. Color I'm not going to touch. You can actually change the color per row and per column. For this case, it's not really important. Tracing, you can actually do some neat things with. You can set a certain shape and kind of fill that shape with tiled objects, and you can actually do things like vary the color, size, opacity, all that stuff based on the colors of the image that you use here. So it's actually pretty useful, but not in this tutorial. Okay, so we're back. We've done our fade out of 30% per row. You might want to randomize that a bit. Not that it will make a huge amount of difference. Let's try 20%. Remove, create. So you don't get them all fading out exactly the same. So that looks, that doesn't look half bad. Okay, so we'll settle on that as our star background. Now you still got the original highlighted. Okay, you can tell because it says down here path. If I had selected one of the clones, it will say clone, I think, or clone of object down here. So we know that we've still got the original object. What I'd like to do is make sure that it's, if we zoom in, I want to move that clone. Let me see, I'm still in the dialog box here. See, if I click on this, now I'm still on the path. I want to make that path, I want to move it. Make sure, sometimes when you create these you get a clone right over top and it becomes hard to select the path, but now we've got it here, no problem. I'm going to do, probably while I have that selected, I'll just increase the blur at this point. I'll try 2, and you can see that all the adjacent clones, all the other clones will blur as well. Maybe 4. Okay, and I actually think they're too big, the stars, what I've got here. So what I'm going to do is actually scale, hold Control Shift, sorry, and scale that down a bit, and you're going to see all the other clones scale down too, because they were too big to start with. Okay, and if you're still unhappy with it, you can again hold Control Shift, shrink it a little bit more. You can do things like changing the opacity of this star. If I wanted to change it, reduce it slightly, then it will reduce all the clones' opacity. Okay, now on a screencast that may be hard to get, the full gist of it, but that's really what I've tried to do is, let me just group this. So I've even got, because of that randomize, I've even got stars that are sitting outside of that rectangle, so you've got to be careful about that. And I believe, let's see if I can get this zoomed in properly. That's the best I'm going to do. So we've got our silhouette, got any objects we want to put on that horizon, whatever you can come up with, and of course you're going to play with these colors. And then, you can use tile clones to create a kind of realistic starry sky. So hopefully that's maybe not as practical as some of the other tutorials I've done, but I think it's kind of neat, and you can do some pretty creative things with it. And that is it. I hope you enjoyed the screencast, and thank you very much for watching.